Peace to the viewing audience. What a real joy it is to greet you on this, what is known as Holy Week. This is the week that we celebrate Jesus's last week on earth. And for the next 6 days, I want to share with you a devotional regarding what was going on in the life of Jesus on each day before he died on the cross of Calvary. I want to begin with Sunday, and I like to label Sunday as the day of celebration because Sunday is the day that Jesus rode in on the donkey, and you heard people say, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna. And I want to share with you a passage in Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. And Matthew's account gives us what took place for Jesus on the Sunday before he died on Friday. Matthew is not the only writer to tell this story. As a matter of fact, Mark tells this story, Luke tells this story, and likewise John tells it. Mark tells it in chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. Luke tells it in chapter 19, verses 29 through 38. And John tells it in chapter 12 of his book, verses 12 through 19. But let's look at Matthew's account. And I want to look at these 11 verses, and I want to just give you something to look for as you go through these 11 verses. So let me give you a breakdown of Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. And here's what you discover. The words from Jesus, 1 through 5. The work for Jesus, verses 6 and 7. And then finally, the worship of Jesus, verses 8 through 11. So in Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, you discover the words from Jesus, verses 1 through 5, and then the work for Jesus, verses 6 and 7, and then finally the worship of Jesus. Let's read through it. I'm reading out of the NIV translation. You follow me along in the translation of your choice, Matthew chapter 21. It reads, verse 1, as they approached Jerusalem, they came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives. Jesus sent 2 disciples, and he said to them, go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away. What do we discover there? The words from Jesus. And he's speaking to his disciples. Now join me at verse number 6 and watch the work for Jesus. The disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them, and they brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on them. They did exactly what Jesus told them to do. That's why I label it the work for Jesus. And then finally, verses 8 through 11, the worship of Jesus. The worship of Jesus. Verse 8 says, a very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed, they shouted, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, who is this? And the crowd answered, this is Jesus, the prophet of Nazareth in Galilee. The worship of Jesus. And you know what we discover when we look at what took place on what we call Palm Sunday? We discover, as a result of Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, that for the Lord, we ought to be willing to do something with our legs. We ought to be willing to do something for the Lord with our hands. And finally, we ought to be willing to do something with the Lord with our voices. Did you catch that? Number one, we ought to be willing to do something for the Lord with our legs. I see it right there in verse number 6, because verse number 6 reads, the disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them to do. What did they do? They went to find the donkey and the colt, and guess how they arrived there? They didn't get there by Lyft. They didn't get there by Uber. They were walking. They did something with their legs. But then secondly, we ought to be willing to do something with our hands. Because verse 8 says, a very large crowd, when Jesus came riding in on the colt, verse 8 says, a very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut down branches and trees and spread them on the road. They were doing something what? With their hands. Some were cutting down branches and laying them down for Jesus, and some were taking off their garments and putting them down for the Lord. And then finally, we should not only do something with our feet and with our legs, but we ought to do something with our voice. It's verse number 9, because verse number 9 says, the crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted what? Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna to the highest. And I say to you today, as a result of Palm Sunday, you and I need to look at what can we do for the Lord with our legs? How can we walk for him? Number 2, what can we do with our hands? How can we give to him? And then finally, what can we do with our voices? How can we shout and make the shout all about him? Sunday indeed was the day of celebration. I trust that this devotional has been helpful to you, and this is your invitation to join me right back here tomorrow for what took place on Monday. Thanks for your time. That's all of my time.